most important aspects of Plato's overall philosophy is the so-called theory of forms. And it is an essential part of this dialogue. And I think that when we reflect on Plato's argument for the immortality of the soul, that it is inseparable from the theory of the form. And whether it is ever explicitly, or whether it's explained in this dialogue, I don't know. It may not be explained in any dialogue in any kind of full sense, but it is explicitly referred to at several points, several key points. The first being, I believe, on page 10, at the bottom, when Socrates says, and what do you say to the next point, Simmias? Do we say that there is such a thing as absolute justice or not? Indeed, we do. And absolute beauty and absolute good. Of course. Have you ever seen any of them with your eyes? Indeed, I have not, he replied. Did you ever grasp them with any bodily sense? I am speaking of all absolutes, whether size or health or strength, in a word, of the essence or real being of everything. Now, it's important to have a notion of what he's talking about here, because it is, I think, very important for the argument for the immortality of the soul to have some idea of what he means by here absolute justice, absolute size, absolute health. In other contexts, we might say the form of justice. What is a form? Well, Socrates investigates things like justice, virtue, beauty. He asks, what is justice? What is beauty? This is what Socrates believes the philosophy is all about, is getting a better understanding of these things. And he would call each of these things a form, or absolute justice, or absolute beauty. It may not be the best translation, I don't know. But what could he possibly mean by that? Well, let's say that we go to a museum. And in the museum, there's a painting, and there's a sculpture, and I don't know, what kind of art is there? I don't know. Let's say there's a film. And we look at them, and we say that each one is beautiful. We call each beautiful. Well, of course, a painting, a sculpture, and a film are very different things from each other. Just as one painting is a very different thing from another painting, or one sculpture from another sculpture, or one sculpture from a film. Let's say a song. We hear a song too, we hear music. And we call each one of those things beautiful. Socrates would say, well, okay, you call them each beautiful, which means that they must share, for him, it would mean that they share some common feature or characteristic. And he would say that that's beauty. That is, if you call them by that same term, beautiful, that must mean that despite all their differences, that in at least one way they're the same. They're beautiful. They have all sorts of different features which are different from the other, but they have one feature which is the same, and that is their beauty. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to call them by the same name unless they had that same feature. So that common element to them all, that common feature or characteristic, beauty, is what Socrates would say the philosopher studies. The philosopher is interested in understanding better. That over and above all the individual things, this painting, this sculpture, this film, this song, over and above all the individual things, particular things that are beautiful. There's something called beauty, or here in our translation it's called absolute beauty. Sometimes it would. It's important to understand that for Socrates, these are not things. These absolutes or forms or in itself entities. These are not things that you can see or touch or taste or feel or hear. These are things that can only be grasped with the intellect, with the mind. These are things that can only be grasped with what Plato is, in our translation, is calling the soul. So when he refers to these things, this is a much discussed issue that Socrates has gone over with his friends. They're all fairly philosophically sophisticated, these people. So it doesn't feel like he has to explain things from the beginning. But a knowledge of these things, the form, is what the philosopher really wants. And since they are things that can be reflected in individual things, individual paintings, let's see, the form of beauty, it's reflected in individual works of art that are beautiful, but you don't know it as a whole. You don't know it in its absolute pure sense. That's something that can only be grasped with the mind. This is, in fact, I think what Socrates has in mind when he's talking about the idea that the philosopher welcomes death, because it's only after death, which is the separation of soul and body, according to Socrates, that the soul can finally know these things in the deepest sense. This is an incredibly important part of Socrates' teaching, or if he has a teaching, or Plato's philosophy. It's also important in terms of the dialogue, as we'll see, because one of the most controversial things in Plato's philosophy is he believed that the forms exist independently, that there's what is sometimes called I think in a derogatory sense, the Platonic heaven, which would be some metaphysical place where the forms exist. I think that's not fair to Plato. That's a rather crude way of putting it. But he does believe the forms exist independently, that they don't exist only insofar as they are features of individual things, which is, I think, what Aristotle believed. He believed they exist independently, and that they are, you might say, pure ideas, that they are eternal, and that they are unchangeable. This will become an important part of his argument for the immortality of the soul. Plato thought that these pure ideas, the forms, the in itself, the absolutes, were what was most real, and that the fact that they were pure ideas made them more real. The fact that you couldn't see them or touch them or taste them or hear them made them more real than the things that you could. Because they were eternal, they were unchangeable. They were things that couldn't be thought of ever going out of existence because they were eternal. This becomes, I think, a very important part of Socrates' argument for the immortality of the soul, because, as we'll see, what I consider to be one of his strongest arguments is the so-called argument from affinity, where he argues that what's most real are ideas, things that can be grasped by the intellect, and that since the soul is most like these things and the body is least like these things, the soul is probably also eternal and unchangeable. But we'll get into the specifics of that later. But I just thought it'd be good to have some grasp, if this is any help, what I've said of what Plato's calling the absolutes here, or Socrates is calling the absolutes here, the so-called theory of forms.